right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Joe Slowik, Director of Cybersecurity Alerting Strategy at Dataminr, is back for another episode. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Always happy to be on the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's always good to catch up. We're at RSA, obviously. How's it going for you? Busy as always, I'm sure.
Always a busy week. A lot of AI, as one might expect, but good time so far.
Yeah, I've avoided the show floor. We were talking about it a minute ago and the whole AI barrage. But yeah, it's out there. It's hard to avoid.
It is. And, for good reason. There's always a little bit of bandwagoning, but it's one of those things where it's like if you're not doing it, using AI, deploying AI, you're probably behind right now.
You're behind, exactly. So I saw a report that you wrote fairly recently on how hacktivist groups are really amping up their targeting of critical infrastructure. So that's what I wanted to talk about, getting a lot of attention. What do you think's driving it? I mean, hacktivism's certainly nothing new, but this targeting of critical infrastructure, there seems to be a lot of different potential angles here.
Right. And, the current news really centers around responses and reactions to the ongoing conflict in Iran, which by the time listeners are hearing this or whatever, hopefully is over, but we'll see.
We'll see.
But that's certainly driving the discussion right now, where you have a variety of either Iran state-linked, state-backed entities or sympathetic entities that have threatened, not really done much, with the exception of one very large medical device manufacturer, which had a very, very bad day earlier in March. But that's certainly top of mind for folks right now. But this goes back a couple of years, thinking about things like the Muleshoe, Texas incident, where you had a hacktivist persona say that they were interacting with a drinking water system and caused a storage tank to discharge at a moment when that was not desirable activity.
Right.
So this has been going on for a couple of years at this point. And it's been interesting to see the shift in hacktivist operations change from just messaging and DDoS activity to really zeroing in on things that we would call critical infrastructure, especially in weakly defended or less well-resourced areas like water, wastewater, trying to do things in power. Not a whole lot of success there as far as I can tell, but it has been a concerning shift.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, that hacktivism not too long ago was about website defacements and this alignment with a social cause of some kind, And so is this shift an indication of maybe their skills improving or something else? What do you read there?
Well, that's a very interesting way to phrase it, because on the one hand, the targeting is concerning, but the actual actions that we see these entities taking or able to take have been largely meh, to use a technical term. I have a good friend, Ron Fabella. He gave a talk at the S4 conference a couple of years ago
I
about
remember it.
low-skilled threat actors. And that still holds to this day, even, where it's deeply concerning that these entities are able to get access to these targets, but so far their ability to do anything meaningful with them has been very circumscribed. And I think we'll continue to see that because, for the listeners who have more of an OT background and such, that a lot of these systems still have engineering and physical safeguards and controls that you can't hack through the HMI. So the one famous example, which has since been discredited, the Oldsmar incident, or alleged incident in the greater Tampa area from a couple of years ago. It's like, oh my goodness, they're going to pump all this chlorine in the water and poison people. Like, well, the design of the system itself on a physical level would prevent the ability to discharge that much treatment material into the water system at that point in time. It's just physically not possible. And I think people need to remember that. But again, walking this back a little bit as well, these entities have been pretty incompetent. Why should we talk these guys up? Because no one likes them. But it's concerning that they're touching these things and that these items are able to be accessed remotely.
Yeah, it's a good point to remember. There's a lot of safeguards and safety systems in place that prevent any real damage, at least so far. So it's a good thing. Do you think, is it still fair to say that there's a motivation or a link to a cause for some of these groups, or is it strictly attention-seeking behavior?
So it definitely seems to be politically motivated. We identified this in response to Western support for Ukraine and seeing Russia-affiliated entities targeting Western organizations like the Muleshoe incident and similar. But also since 2023 and Israel's response for the Gaza, or for the the Hamas terrorist
Yes.
incident, and then everything that's gone on since then, have seen a lot of other entities either professing sympathy for and what's the word I'm looking for? Joint cause with Palestinian interests, but with a little bit further research, it usually seems to be that there is some Iran link, either direct, in some cases like Handala is very closely associated with, and the U.S. government just noted this in a takedown message for some of their public messaging sites linked with Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, MOIS. I can't remember what the acronym actually breaks down to, but anyway, doesn't matter. So there's definitely a state-directed element to this, and Google released some research a year or two ago about how Sandworm, that nasty threat actor, was also effectively managing some of the pro-Russia hacktivist groups as well. So there's a certain degree of astroturfing that's involved here, to use a historical term for, fake political causes, but there do seem to be some legitimate, I guess we can throw air quotes around that, activist, non-state activity as well.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of the more interesting items that we're seeing in this space, it's less about the political motivation as opposed to being controlled by, funded by, or otherwise directed by some other state interest.
And they may not have a choice in the matter.
Yeah.
Are you seeing commonalities among these groups in terms of either capabilities or even down to understanding the engineering behind some of the critical infrastructure, for example?
So it has been interesting in seeing some groups. So for those who've been following this space, especially recently, we've seen an entity known as Cardinal, which has rebranded to Monarch for reasons unknown, that has been claiming access to nuclear power infrastructure, which on its face is deeply concerning.
Sure.
But if you look a little deeper, it starts to not really pass muster or scrutiny, but putting together what appeared to be some pretty decent looking screenshots, almost certainly faked or assembled from other items, of control systems that are allegedly for a nuclear power plant. And I've talked to a couple of domain experts in this area, that if you know what you're looking at and you look at these items, like, no, that doesn't actually look realistic.
Yeah.
But for someone who does not have that background, it does look quite scary. So there's that level of understanding of what needs to be put into a reasonably passable item to show, like, hey, I've accessed the Dataminr reactor, or there was a reactor in France that was also advertised as having been compromised. The other element of things has been really more simplistic. So people, if you're looking in social media or, various researchers that have presented at conferences over the years, the concept of the Shodan Safari, of just looking for things that are open and accessible from the internet.
I have that question coming up.
Yeah, but, it's been around for a bit, and it seems like these hacktivist groups have taken that very much to heart and are really just looking for things that are roughly Western aligned or in a country of interest or country that they don't like.
Right.
And looking for whatever they can access. And that seems to be a very common tactic across all of these groups, of being very opportunistic in terms of their activity.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned, too, that you wrote a lot of this in a post on the Dataminr site about this hacktivist activity. And you cover the Cardinal incident as well, and the screenshots there. These guys really like to brag on whether it's Telegram or whatever dark web channel they may have access to. Again, is that useful for somebody like yourself, or is that really kind of exposing that maybe these guys aren't what they say?
I mean, it's interesting because, for one, advertising it on Telegram is a very popular resource in certain parts of the world, less so in other parts of the world.
Right.
And the extent to which this messaging on that social media website really attracts attention in places like the United States and similar is debatable. Having said that, though, it is an attempt to try to sow panic, to try to induce fear that, hey, we have access to these big scary things or whatever and can do something nasty with them. But where was I going with this? Oh, yes. But again, looking into what has actually been achieved has been relatively minimalistic so far. So not to say anything bad about, say, the town of Muleshoe, Texas, or similar, but we're not talking about New York City here,
Sure.
or London, or some,
Right.
We're talking about pretty tiny, relatively obscure places that just so happen to have an external facing HMI that was accessible.
Sure.
So yeah, I don't want to completely say like, oh, the people who live here don't matter. They do matter, but we're not talking about sowing mass chaos or even the potential for doing so if these adversaries even knew what they were doing.
I mean, the fact of the matter is these small, especially water facilities, these small communities, they just don't have the resources, obviously, that a London or a New York would. That's an obvious statement, but it comes down to expertise. It comes down to people. I mean, there's, you probably have one IT person.
Right. Well, or you get a situation where the integration contractor comes in and sets everything up once. They leave everything in an open state so they can debug things and get everything up and running, and then they never reset it back. And the people on site don't know or don't have the awareness that they still have things that are internet accessible, and puts them in a really bad position that they may not even realize that they're in, which is very unfortunate.
And I mean, I guess what we're kind of dancing around is these are internet-facing assets, and they're accessible. It seems that there's been enough written about why we shouldn't be doing this. Why is it still a thing? Is it,
I mean,
again, to the resource question, something else?
Resourcing, visibility, and even awareness of the problem set. Like I said, you could have things get set up once, put in a fairly open state in order to troubleshoot things on initial install, and then no one ever reverts changes or locks things down after the fact, resulting in this sort of activity. If we want to think about like what are meaningful steps that organizations, governments can do in order to secure critical infrastructure, first and foremost would just be identifying all these externally accessible assets and lock them down.
Right.
So it is actually interesting. I will give credit to another organization here. So Census did a really interesting research project where they leveraged their internet scanning data and identified a number of water and wastewater facilities, and then reached out to them to try to lock that down. Like, we need more of that. As opposed to many other more potentially exotic items, because if we're leaving the back door wide open and accessible, it doesn't matter how many layered defenses you're putting on the front door, because you're allowing adversaries to sneak in other ways.
Yeah. And I mean, the default credentials and old protocols that are out there is really concerning, and now those exposures are coming to light. So.
Yeah. I mean, one of the points I made in that blog is that if people are really concerned about these hacktivist sort of threats, the simple things, the most direct ways to remove or to address that threat, get things off the internet. If it needs to be on the internet, make sure it has robust authentication associated with it, and then keep an eye on it.
Right.
If you can do those three things, and the third one, if you're doing the first two, you might not even need to do the third one of monitoring closely, but even just removing or attack surface minimization, robust authentication mechanisms, that'll address everything from the Handalas and the cyber avengers of the world, all the way up to a Volt Typhoon for that matter.
Right. Yeah, it'll move them on to someone else, hopefully.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, there is that aspect.
Yeah. From even a researcher's point of view, but from an attacker's point of view, what does a Shodan search, a census search return in terms of device information, useful information to an attacker?
No, I mean, so these are what I would characterize as dual-use resources. That they can be very powerful for defenders and researchers, but unfortunately that same power, if used maliciously, can be very helpful for an adversary as well. So thinking about things from legitimate desired usage, a asset owner or similar organization can be like, hey, I know my external IP range. What am I exposing to the internet? Well, that's a really good thing to know in order to then lock that down or reduce attack surface. But attackers can do the same sort of thing and say, hey, what external assets do I have that are listening on Modbus, DNP3, IEC 104, and similar sorts of, industrial protocols and such, to then identify assets that are of likely critical nature that could be interacted with directly, which is concerning.
And are you seeing a trend where hacktivists or state actors, whoever, are enumerating assets and in order to target classes of assets versus individual organizations, for example?
Yeah, I think we see a little bit of that. And it's interesting, so I made the joke about the Shodan Safari element of things, and I think that aligns with what we see with a lot of these hacktivist entities that don't have very well, good resourcing. But then if we take a step up to more the true concerning state-aligned, state-directed adversaries, like your Russian GRU, like your Volt Typhoons or whatever, they are able to develop and implement these scanning mechanisms directly and not rely on the commercial databases to do so. And as a result, I think we see not just direct targeting of such items, but opportunistic targeting of certain technologies or certain platforms for which exploits exist or for which capabilities are present.
Yeah. So you can probably cut that information up regionally or by industry, right?
Yep, exactly. And then hopefully you avoid the honeypots if you're the adversary along the way.
Those are out there too, right?
Yes.
And so groups like the Cyber Avengers or Cyber Army of Russia Reborn seem to be the first reference in a lot of these disclosures. Hey, these guys are out there.
Yep.
How do you characterize those two groups, their specific capabilities or intentions? They differ much from the pack?
I mean, I would argue that for almost all of these entities, the differences are very slight and of a very, fine-grained nature, that generally speaking, we see some of the similar sorts of methodologies and motivating items in terms of anti-Western stance, opportunistic targeting of accessible assets, and then doing so largely from a messaging standpoint, claiming access or claiming the possibility of executing something disruptive, but not really doing so or not successfully doing so in most instances. Again, caveating that where we saw a couple of weeks ago in March, one major organization get hit via a wiping attack, not a wiper. There was no malware as far as we can tell with available information so far. So the way I phrased it in discussing the blog referenced earlier is that every once in a while a blind squirrel is going to find a nut. That hacktivists are going to get lucky occasionally, and so we can't completely discount it. But we also need to appropriately understand the threat that for the most part this is more of a nuisance entity than it is like a Volt Typhoon, like a Sandworm or some other entity that has either shown the ability to disrupt items or is very well linked to a desire for such disruptive items.
And it's probably very important to make that distinction between those two types of groups, because defending against them, I would imagine, requires very different approaches.
Right.
So the Striker attack, they were very upfront about allegedly why they carried it out was in revenge for the bombing that horrific bombing on the school in Iran. Is that kind of the next generation of these types of attacks where we're going to see this alignment become a little bit more out front?
I mean, we've seen it for a while, though.
Yeah.
I mean, let's go back almost 15 years at this point. Shamoon, 2012, or 20 something.
I think it was 2012,
Yeah, somewhere around that time frame. Saudi Aramco had almost their entire IT network wiped, burned to the ground, similar to Striker, in this case using malware, Shamoon, as part of a response by an Iran-linked entity for tensions in the Gulf area. So we've been doing this for a minute. This is not necessarily new. I think where it becomes interesting is that it's really curious why Striker, of all entities, was hit as far as this. I've seen theories ranging from the Hendala Group or whatever confused Striker Medical with Striker, the assault vehicle used by the U.S. Army, which would be very interesting if true. Two, it was just opportunistic availability of leaked credentials for sale in an underground forum, and it's like, well, it's a Western company, we'll go after them.
Right.
So it's still a little murky as to why this took place. But, I think two takeaways from this. One, it goes back to the point where activists in general are largely nuisance threats, but can still get lucky, so we can't completely discount them. But the second point, like I emphasized earlier, is that the ways to get around or to close off avenues for these entities are really security basics. That taking care of some really fundamental posture items effectively disables most abilities associated with such entities.
Sure. Basic credentials, getting rid of default credentials, things
getting
like
rid
that,
of default credentials, enforcing multi-factor authentication where possible, security hardening, attack surface minimization, eating your cyber vegetables, basically.
So just to wrap up the Striker discussion, I mean, a wiper malware isn't exactly commodity malware, though. Am I mistaken there?
I mean, it's interesting because if we even go back to Shamoon, for example, it's not exactly a complex piece of software.
Okay.
It was interesting in that it took a legitimate driver, the LDOS raw disk driver, and implemented that for disk access in order to then allow for wipe down to the hard drive level instead of just doing a logical wipe. So that's kind of cool, but it's also not, I'm going to say the S word. It's not Stuxnet level.
I thought you were going sophisticated.
We can say sophisticated also as the other S word. But, there are plenty of tools, applications, libraries that legitimately allow for this level of disk access. And in the Striker case, they didn't even need that. Instead, leverage the ability to remotely administer devices, because it appears that their Microsoft Intune instance was compromised and leveraged in order to execute disk wiping commands. So to paraphrase, Peter Parker's uncle here, with great power comes great responsibility. With respect to just these sort of legitimate systems can be easily contorted into malicious use.
And I mean, with Stryker too, it's not just the company; they were a supplier. This is a distribution issue at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. Well, it's not really funny, but it is interesting when that event happened. In fact, I saw some of your colleagues at this event as well for the HIMSS conference in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Giant healthcare IT event happened right in the middle of that event, and immediately became one of the top issues of conversation for it. That like, oh my goodness, what happened here? Because it is a massive supplier to hospitals, clinics, etc.
But this one stands out because it's a damaging attack. I think most of these are disruptive. Is the damage part of this equation just a line they don't want to cross, or maybe aren't capable of?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think there's, on the one hand, a awareness that if we do this, then we're probably crossing a line and we're going to get on someone's radar for sure. But also, like I was saying earlier, even the ability to necessarily engage in meaningful disruption is limited because of other safety controls, other security controls that go beyond the cyber realm into physical and engineering safeguards. So while we see things like the Muleshoe water tower, the dam, air quotes around that, in Norway that was impacted, which I think was a fish hatchery or something along those lines. I
believe so, yeah.
So not exactly the most critical of critical infrastructure here. That we see these items affect relatively small, under-resourced and similar entities, but you're not going to see this at the Hoover Dam or a massive Exelon nuclear power plant sitting somewhere in the Midwest or something along those lines.
I mean, okay, that's a fair question. What do they have that someone who's smaller or less resourced doesn't have? And is it just their ability to spend some money on detection and monitoring, or
that, and the dedicated resources in order to do these sorts of activities? Because if I'm talking about a rural or municipal water utility, they might have an IT guy or two, or IT person or two.
Right.
Security is part of their remit, but it's not the only thing that they need to do. And the ability to even positively identify what their external posture is limited, because they might not even be able to afford a Shodan license, or hire someone to do external scanning of their infrastructure to figure these sorts of things out. So something that isn't immediately obvious to them then comes up as an opportunistic or a target of opportunity for these entities, and it's just a mismatch in terms of motivation and capability that is unfortunately then leveraged for advertising access or the possibility of disruption.
And in terms of defending these internet-facing assets, I mean, they're up there, and without a kind of a wholesale tear down of these things, the problem isn't going to go away. How do we advocate to these smaller, less resourced organizations? Hey, change these default passwords, etc.
Yeah, this is where efforts like what I talked about earlier for what Census did is, like, first off, like, just notify these places when you find them. We don't have to score internet cool points and post it on X or whatever and say, like, haha, look what I found. It's like, well, it's not that hard to figure out these entities, and reach out to them or reach out to the municipality that they operate in and say, hey, we found this. Hopefully someone's listening, because that's the other aspect, is that people have to be willing to take this criticism, that it's not just like, who the hell is this, or why are you hacking my stuff? It's like, no, I'm trying to help. So looking for those avenues for collaboration and similar, and then really it is about the under-resourced entities that are out there. They got to suck it up and realize that you are in the crosshairs for some people, and it's unfortunate, but it's not going away. And so there does need to be a realization and a willingness to respond to that effectively through things like attack surface management and similar.
All right, Joe, great to catch up as always.
Thanks
so much.
Bye-bye.